find it remarkable that we were all asked as presenters to come here and talk about turning points.
Emotion never lies and never lies still. So I use that a lot too. It's like, you can say, I'm going to suppress this thing, but it's going to sit down there and grow and build, and it's going to come out in chronic health problems, cardiovascular disease, stress-related stuff, emotional outbursts.
I remember actively resisting being the man therapist.
A lot of men will talk about feeling wrecked.
I haven't cried in 25 years, and I'm not going to start now.
I had this client, he'll talk about feeling like he had this steel ball in the middle of his chest. He would just shove these feelings into it, and they couldn't get out, but he could feel that kind of pressure building.
Have you ever wondered what masculinity even is in the modern era? Are you ready to move beyond the macho bully or the soy boy archetypes? I'm Marc Azoulay, and this is the Men's Therapy Podcast. Together, we'll explore how neuroscience, Jungian psychology, and Buddhist philosophy can transform your life, your marriage, and your business. Are you ready to deep dive into the minds of men? Let's begin. Hello, and welcome back to the Men's Therapy Podcast. I'm your host, Marc Azoulay, and I'm here with Ryan McKelley. I'm really excited to have him because he comes from the world of academia. He is a professor that teaches at the University of Wisconsin, La Crosse campus. He's got a TED Talk on men and masculinities, and he's out there educating students about what it means to be a man and kind of the anthropological development of masculinity. He also does corporate work with a company called Lyra and has worked with major companies such as Google and Walmart. So Ryan, welcome to the show.
Mark, thanks for having me. I've been listening to your show for the last couple of weeks, and I love it, so it's an honor to be here.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, I appreciate you taking the time and just getting the word out to guys. The idea with this show is that most podcast listeners are men, so we want to go where men already are and try to share some of this knowledge that come down from our ivory towers that our industry can often be in. So I always like starting with the personal story. So what has been your journey with masculinity? How'd you get into wanting to be an expert on this? Take it away.
Kind of reluctantly, I guess. It's only been recently I've tried to capture my childhood, and I would describe it as like pioneer philosophy. So I had a younger brother and older sister, and looking back, my parents kind of taught my brother and I how to do all kinds of stuff. So we could re-roof a house, change oil in a car, do all the art, but we also learned how to sew and cook and clean. And so I think I always thought that was cool to be able to feel like I could do whatever I needed, whatever the situation was. Although in hindsight, my sister she never did all the masculine stuff. So she kind of stayed doing the kind of traditionally feminine roles in a household. I'm sharing that because part of me probably was always kind of curious about like gender and why boys get to do some things and girls another. The other piece, though, there were probably a couple of situations too, though. I was an athlete, but I wasn't in like the baseball or football or basketball. Like I swam and I played soccer, and I think I was always even aware that those weren't even kind of as masculine sports go. My dad was a all-state running back. He wrestled in like 187 in high school, so he was like a big muscular dude. I was not. So I was like this, kind of scrawny kid, and he never put any pressure on me ever. And yet, I think about, boys looking up to their dad. There was still always this part of me that was like, oh, I'm never going to be like that. And I will just share, there's one thing that kind of stood out to me. I remember in middle school being at this like Halloween party and whatever, I think people were doing back rubs and stuff. And this girl that I had a crush on, was like giving me a massage on my shoulders. And she kind of, she said like, ooh, you're so skinny. And I just remember feeling like, oh, and so like there was always that kind of part of me, kind of wondering, oh, what would it would be like to, to be a lot more masculine. So that's probably a big piece of it, although I didn't recognize that too much later. And looking back, I definitely suffered a pretty significant depressive episode in 7th grade, probably about every 10 years. And I was just in a household where counseling wasn't a thing. And I would have benefited from seeking help. So I'm sharing all that to say, I wasn't even interested in psychology in college. I was pre-med. I graduated in the first tech boom. And so I went into, tech consulting, web development, just for the money, for the wrong reasons. And I didn't enjoy it. And so I kind of look back, like what were the things I'd always been interested in? And I really was always interested in psychology and kind of masculinity. Never thought it was like something you could study. So when I went back to get my doctorate in clinical and counseling psychology, that was Aaron Rockland, a researcher at UT Austin who was into men's issues. And so, he's, kind of noticed my application. I had mentioned about executive coaching because I noticed that was a big thing that was happening in corporate. And I hear guys talk, male executives saying, "Hey, I'm working on this thing with my coach." I never heard him say anything about working on something with their therapist. So I started wondering, like, what's this coaching thing? And I got connected with a coach at IBM. We did some coaching. And I said, well, that feels a lot like therapy. So anyway, that was my dissertation idea before I was even in graduate school. So all that stuff pieced together, it was like the men's resistance to seeking help, which I had, and it's still hard for me. And that was really my early research. Another big research project was men's depression and how it can look different than what's typically in the DSM. So anyway, that's kind of the pieces I'll kind of throw together that just all kind of fell into place. And then in graduate school, I started working with men because there weren't a lot of male therapists. And I just loved it because there was a real need there. I felt like I could connect on men, with their lived experience.
Yeah, I think it's incredible, right? Like, I think being a male clinician and training male clinicians, like you said, we are a minority in the industry. And I think even though psychology in many ways started from men, right? You talk about analysis and all that, it is now female dominated. So I think having as many male voices as possible is really helpful. They'll balance scales and male researchers and things like that. It's really critical. So I'm curious, kind of your dissertation in male depression, I guess, let's start there. How does that look different than what we think of when you think of depression?
Yeah. And if I'm going to put it in like two big categories, and I always say, like, of course there's, variation here, like anybody can exhibit any range, but generally girls and women are socialized to internalize their mood symptoms, right? So they're more likely to ruminate. They're more likely to even express sadness, tears, that kind of stuff. Maybe a little bit of anhedonia, lack of interest in things. Men, on the other hand, tend to externalize. And so they're more likely to engage in distraction. And that can be through video game play, overworking, like that was my issue, substance use, irritability, anger, aggression, denial. So those are kind of like the big way. In the DSM, if you look at the diagnostic criteria for major depressive disorder, it doesn't always include some of those externalizing behaviors. And so, there's been research since I was even in graduate school showing those two big clusters. And so, with men, nobody knew I was depressed. And they call it masked depression. I was like, a master at hiding it. And I think a lot of boys and men learn how to do that quite effectively. And it just builds and builds and builds till it becomes too much. And then we see, those, high risk for suicide and those types of behaviors. But I think generally that's how I would describe, kind of men's depression or mass depression as it's been called.
Yeah. I mean, when I see that with the guys that I work with, and I've struggled with that off and on as well, like, I think as men, because we're in that man box, right? We're in that like tiny little definition of what we can be. And for a lot of guys, as long as we're functioning, right, as long as we're like going to work, we're like being a dad, or even going to the gym, doing healthy behaviors on the outside, like we can often lie to ourselves and be like, I'm fine, right? It doesn't matter that I go home and I have no energy, or I don't feel the need to talk to anybody, or I don't want anyone to know about me. And I think we push people away, like you said, either through anger or irritability or just like withdrawal. But as long as, as long as we're functioning, right? As long as we're functioning. And, we look at the DSM, and I think this is removed from the most recent one, but they used to have that GAD, right? The general like functioning scale. And like, I think a lot of guys would like score high on that, right? But like, we're deeply depressed underneath it, right? Even though we're hitting those criteria.
Yeah, that's a great example. I hadn't thought about that global assessment of functioning scale in a while. Yeah. When you said that, I just remember something that I share with my class when I teach it too. I talk about like hiding and functioning. So I was a competitive swimmer, and I think in part that was part of my issue back in seventh grade. Like we spent like 20 something hours in the pool a week. That was a lot of time to be in your head. And sometimes I remember in these long sets that would last maybe 10, 15 minutes, like I'd be screaming underwater. I remember crying in my goggles, and then I'd zip it all back up at the end of that set. And so that was an example of I would find this time to kind of hide what I was experiencing. And then again, nobody knew what was going on. So that's kind of an extreme version, but it just popped in my head. I haven't thought about that in a long time.
Yeah, it's actually pretty common. I mean, there's a lot of guys that I talk to that like cry at the gym, right? When they have that time to be in their own head, all that stuff starts to come out. So yeah, I want to talk about that a little bit more. Like, what is the internal feeling of male depression, right? What are some of the feelings that we're having behind the mask?
Yeah. Well, so, I do a workshop on kind of noticing distress in people, and and again, this is like an extreme version of it, but we think about like suicidal ideation, just his thoughts of just kind of being in overwhelming pain and wanting to get away from it. A lot of men will talk about feeling trapped, like and I think even with depression is like this feeling of being trapped and kind of don't have that ability or the skills or the context that they can kind of let some of that stuff out. I had a client, and I use a metaphor a lot in my clinical work. I had this client, talk about feeling like he had this steel ball in the middle of his chest. It was like hermetically sealed, and I was like, well, and he's like, he would just shove these feelings into it. And then they couldn't get out, but he could feel that kind of pressure building. And I hear like versions of that from guys a lot, kind of that, feeling it right there kind of viscerally in their bodies, but not really having maybe the language to kind of connect to what the feeling is.
Yeah, I think as guys, we can do that, right? I mean, like I have so many like very visceral experiences where I'm just like, okay, not today, push it down, put it somewhere, right? To focus on my goal, I have to just like get my life going. And I think, a lot of guys feel that, whether it be about career or exercise or family or whatever, where they're just like so focused on the goal that they minimize themselves. And many of the guys I work with end up feeling very empty. Like they don't even know who they are if they don't have all those roles.
There was it's a name of a chapter in this textbook that I use in my masculinity course by Smiler and Kilmartin. And I think it was a Freudian phrase. It's like emotion never lies and never lies still. So I use that a lot too. It's like, you can say I'm going to suppress this thing, but it's going to sit down there and grow and build, and it's going to come out in chronic health problems, cardiovascular disease, stress-related stuff, emotional outbursts. But
yeah, so let me ask you this, because the course you teach goes into anthropology, goes to kind of the histories of masculinities. Has it always been this way? I think when I look at the field, there's like kind of two answers, right? Some people are like, yes, it's always been this way. In fact, it was worse before because we didn't have all these structures. And some people are like, no, there were tons of outlets for men, in different cultures and throughout history. I'm curious where you lie on that debate.
We only have an hour, don't we? So this is, my answer is, my snarky answer always is both and. I do situate the course when I'm talking, here we are in the US, that's where I'm teaching this class. And I'll say this like dominant masculinity that we're often talking about is really kind of a 1950s, it's like a post-World War II 1950s version of masculinity. And what's cool, if you look either cross-culturally or even throughout history within a culture, masculinity has just gone like, in all these different directions. And so my students get a kick out of seeing, like I'll show them images of like Renaissance Europe and medieval kings at the height of masculine power, and they're wearing wigs, high heels, tights, dresses. And so, right. Yeah. And it's like all this stuff we think about masculinity is malleable, and it changes based on all these different levers. And so, no, I don't think masculinity has been this way at all times throughout all of history. You can even read, letters that men used to write to each other that were, very passionate letters about their friendship. And then if you look cross-culturally, even in today's world, I think the more some cultures are being exposed to Western media portrayals, we're actually seeing a little bit more uniform versions of masculinity. But, hand-holding in Indonesia and parts of Southeast Asia between friends. There's all these exceptions all over the place. And I think there have been throughout history. The one line I use a lot, though, is this, because we have this norm of kind of self-reliance and independence for men. Nobody got here alone. Nobody got to any point by themselves. And so it's often trying to really help men and boys, think about interdependence. Anyway, so that's a long way of saying, no, it hasn't always been this way, and it won't always be this way. We have lots of flexibility.
Yeah. So you talked about malleable masculinity. I know that's a huge part of your theory and the way that you teach your classes, right? Mind just unpacking that for the audience?
Yeah. It actually, it came out of that the phrase, it was in reaction to toxic masculinity. Because I'm going to be honest with you, I can't stand that phrase because it just paints masculinity in this an entirely negative light. It shuts down conversation. And so I started thinking about what is it when people actually say that, what is it that they actually mean? And then I kind of came up with these 4 R's. We're really talking about regressive, repressive, rigid, and reactive masculinity. It's like those behaviors that some boys, men do some of the time that cause problems for self or others. And so I thought, really, like with masculinity, it's not like I don't ask clients to like get rid of or eliminate parts of themselves that they enjoy about being a man, like whatever that might be. Let's take competitiveness, but instead, think about malleability and being able to be adaptable in situations. So if I use that R of rigid, rigid to me with masculinity means I have like one way of interacting with somebody, and I'm going to do that across contexts. And so maybe that works in a work environment, but now it's not working in my romantic partnership, marriage, parenting a child, a friendship. And so like extreme rigidity is a problem. So malleability is like, okay, I can learn to show up in this space this way, and it's got some benefits. And then I'm going to learn to show up this way in this other space that has some benefits, and try to get men to be fuller human beings and not these kind of caricatures of a man.
I think it's really well said. When in my work, I like use the analogy of like a toolbox, right? The idea of like having the right tool for the job instead of just like always being a hammer, and I think men are being called to do more. I think first and foremost by our partners and by our kids, probably as a close second. I think we were being called to be more emotional, to be more tender, to be more inspiring, to teach, right? To do some of those softer skills that for whatever reason, we just like stopped doing.
I know. And that's a great, like for whatever reason, who knows?
Yeah.
There's a metaphor that I use. Actually, I have to give my wife credit for this. And I have one right next to me because are you familiar with that small Swiss Army knife? This is like the basic version.
Okay.
So It's got, let's say, 4 or 5 tools on it. And that's why I think of like restrictive masculinity. It's like, all right, you have the knife and then you use the knife in all situations. And my wife's like, masculinity should be more like the Swiss champ. So this is like, this is like the one on steroids. Yeah. And I use this with my clients because sometimes men will say, I'm afraid therapy is going to make me like soft, or it's going to tell me not to be a man. I can't like joke around with my friends and give each other shit. And I was like, no. Like that, I'm not going to take away any of those base things that you have, but wouldn't it be awesome to add some additional tools like on that, Swiss champ that you can pull out that magnifying glass when you need it, or you can pull out that file or whatever. So I'm not taking anything away. The idea is to add stuff. And that for me has helped, I think, them see that they're not having to give up things. And at least counseling and therapy can be a place where they gain things and learn things.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think as men, we're attracted to that, right? Like I find in a lot of my marketing messaging and the way I talk to dudes, it's like they need to feel like they're getting an outcome, and they need to feel like they don't want to be weak, right? They want to feel like they're growing. It's more about growth mindset versus like you're sick and you need to heal, right? I just went to a conference recently and the theme of it was creating healing spaces. And I was presenting on masculinity, and, kind of my snarky thing is like, even the word healing spaces, I think is going to push most men away. Right? Like we don't want to enter a healing space because that means that we have to say that we're broken or that we are sick or that we're wounded. And that in of itself is a huge barrier to entry into treatment.
Although, in hearing that phrase, like, to be wounded, this reminds me, I've got a colleague in Australia, Kerry Conran, who's been in this space for about 50 years. He's retired now. He was really big in etymology, like understanding the history of words. And he had used that example. Like if you look up vulnerability or vulnerable in the dictionary, it's, one of the definitions is able to be wounded, or weak. And that's kind of our contemporary understanding of it. But he had said there was I think a more ancient Greek version of it that means able to be seen. So like when I talk about vulnerability with clients, I call it the V word because a lot of people have baggage with it. But I'll say, it's not about able to be wounded. Let's think about it, able to be seen. Like, wouldn't you want your wholeness, to be seen by those people who you choose to show? And it's not like you have to be, a wide open book across all contexts. But at the end of the day, like most of us do want to be seen by those people in our lives. Like, if I go back to the example I used at the beginning, like when I was struggling in middle school, and then like all I wanted was to be seen. Like I wanted somebody to recognize that I was having a hard time, but I didn't know how to communicate it. I didn't think that there would be people who could handle it. And so that, like to get away from the wounded piece and reframe it into that able to be seen stuff.
I love that, right? And I think so many men struggle with loneliness, whether they, can verbalize that or not, I mean, so much of us are disconnected. And I think that's become the norm where it's like, yeah, I got my friends from college, but I see them like once a year for like a road trip. And those are like my closest friends, we aren't really seen, and I think back to that man box, we're validated for our roles, or validated for our outcomes, for what we can provide, for what we can do in the world, but not really who we are. So I wonder for you, like, I guess I speak to the audience, like what parts could a man be seen for? Because when I even use that language with guys, they're like, what do you mean? Like, what else is there besides like my job and my kids and, how much I can bench?
Right. Yeah, you literally could be seen benching, I guess. Well, that's where, a lot of the work. Let me actually back up. So we were talking about suppression before too, like suppression of like negative, or I should say unpleasant. I don't even use negative as a word for emotion, but say unpleasant emotions. I also remind folks that when you do that, and this is also some of Brene Brown work and other people, but you also like numb the positive side of human experience. So I always try to be really explicit to say like, yeah, if you're going to say no to pain and shut that down, you're also shutting yourself down to joy, and maybe compassion. I have a book I haven't written yet in my head that like, it's like the death of giddiness. So there's this idea that, I'll watch boys of a certain age, like something good happens to them and there's like giddiness, right? There's like that, their playfulness, they're super excited, they're jumping all around. And I watch boys through adolescence and adulthood, like that stuff tends to really kind of get muted and disappear for a lot of men. And so I think a lot of the work is trying to help men rediscover that, like, that sense of themselves where they can actually get giddy. I mean, I've even joked with my wife, it's like, oh, if we won the lottery, I mean, she'd probably be bouncing on the walls and I'd be like, that's cool. Even though on the inside, I might be like freaking out. So I'm always trying to be like, be aware of what are the cues around the environment that I feel comfortable being giddy in, and then what are the ones where I feel kind of shut down. And it's with like really close friends that I've known for a long time that I'm comfortable with, where, I can totally be giddy. So it's really just trying to pay attention to what those environmental cues are, and then starting to encourage guys to start to test it, right? And start with low hanging fruit, and like let some of that stuff out or in. But we have to kind of pause and learn mindfulness probably first to even notice when we're having those thoughts or feelings.
Yeah, what do you think the barriers to that? Is it fear? Is it grief? Is it pain? Like what? Because I agree completely. I think we do shut down and we just like smooth out. We just like level out, I think, as men.
Yeah. Well, again, I think my smart ass comment was yes. Like to all those things, I think it will probably, it is different for different men. And yet those things that well, I'll use the example of the male emotional funnel. Have you ever come across that like terminology?
No, I have not. No.
Now I'm blanking on the person. It was in a book in like the late 80s. And I use this a lot when I teach and then in my clinical work. This idea that we all come to the world with a full range of human emotions. And we'll call some of the negative ones. So we have anger and shame and embarrassment and guilt and fear, all that kind of stuff. Little boys have them all. And then through adolescent development, it's like a funnel. At the end, there's only like a couple that society lets them have. And anger is like one of them. We don't love anger, but we tolerate it from men. And so I think what gets in the way is it's like those tender emotions that turn into reactive anger. I had a client say anger is sadness's bodyguard. And I love that phrase. And so I think those tender feelings of rejection, humiliation, sad, like whatever, rather than recognize that that's what somebody's feeling in that moment, it's much easier to go the kind of man box, that culturally sanctioned response, and either shut down, be angry, make a joke, right? Like we've learned these scripts to respond to those things. And then it's like 2 hours later, they're thinking, and I think a lot of guys don't know how to slow down that reel. And like, I'm pretty anti anger management in the traditional sense, that it's something you angered. It's like, why don't we figure out what the micro emotion was half a second before anger had to step in? And I think once you start to teach men how to do that, that opens up a whole, range of life experiences that they can start to try out.
Yeah, I found for the anger management guys, what I say is like, you got to be less angry more often, because it's that same thing, like putting it in that sphere over and over again, and then it just blows up. And, I think as men, our emotions can get violent, right? Like we can hit people, we can suicide, we can, use substances. Like we are powerful creatures. So it's like the idea of like, kind of like bleeding off that pressure as much as possible. So I guess like where the rubber meets the road, I guess I am curious, how do the people in our lives be more open to vulnerability? Because what I hear from my guys and what I've experienced also is like, we learn all that stuff in therapy, right? We learn to be vulnerable. We learn to be more emotional. We learn to be giddy, whatever it is. And more often than not, the people in our lives also can't handle it. Right? Like I think the culture is also reinforcing that men should not be those things. I think we got those messages growing up, and I think a lot of us are still getting those messages.
Yeah. I'm so glad you mentioned that. One of my favorite assignments in my class is I have the students do a gender aware interview with a man. So they have to find somebody 18 years or older who's not their romantic partner, and ask them a whole bunch of questions for like an hour and a half, and then, kind of reflect on it. And it's amazing how often I'll hear from female students whose interviewee, it could be a dad, a grandpa, a brother, whoever, maybe during it, they'll show some emotion, like they may cry or whatever. And then they don't know how to handle it, and they shut it down. They sometimes shame it. I hear a lot of reflections from all students, but about like, when my boyfriend cried for the first time, I completely freaked out. And
yes,
yeah. Or a guy will say, when I opened up to my girlfriend, she completely froze and did not handle it. So I do think the answer, again, it's like it's hard, but it's like everybody has a role in this. It can't just be, men trying to be different in these social contexts. Like the social context also has to learn how to respond. If you expect men to be a certain way and only have a limited set of emotions, how are you going to meet them when they violate that? So I think that's part of it. I think I just forgot the other parts. It'll come back to me when I talk about it.
Yep.
So everybody has a role. I hear it a lot too. If I do workshops for parents in schools, and teachers as well, I've done a lot of those where they're saying, we want to create an environment where we're more supportive of boys. And yet there's always, the reaction is always the fear. Like, I know this is good for my boy, but if I teach them this, are they going to then get bullied? So there's, and here are the very same people who are saying they want things to be different for the boys. And they're saying, but I don't think I can do it. And so if we're all kind of colluding in that, we all want this, but we're not willing to take that risk, then it's just like a setup. And then we get kind of we get stuck there. Now I remember what I was going to say. It's the gender role stuff. And I think I got trapped in this too. There's there's like the external gender roles, like the stuff I described as a kid, like, changing the oil or sewing something. Like those are things people do. Those are activities that really any human can do. And I think when we talk about, we want men to change, it's like, we want them to, dress differently, care for their body. Like some of that stuff I think is external. I think the real challenge is the internal gender role stuff. So I think we need to focus more on that. So doesn't matter what it looks like on the surface. And I use the example, I've gay male clients, and it's like, they are still marinating in the same masculine norms as everybody else. And so there's emotional restriction and there's irritability and stuff. So we need to focus, I think, more on the internal experience of gender roles and the sociality or the interaction of gender roles instead of just what people do, like what job they do or what task they complete.
Right. Yeah. I think it's just like surface. It's just like the costume,
Right.
And like that costume has like changed over the years.
Yeah.
But can you expand on that? Can you give some more examples of some of the internal gender roles that guys might experience and how they can be restrictive? If you're enjoying the podcast so far, please hit the subscribe button and leave us a review. Your feedback helps us to reach more men and inspire them to become the best versions of themselves. Thank you for your support. And now back to the show.
Well, so, one is developing some sort of a contemplative life, or like, kind of being meta, like being aware of what you're thinking and what you're feeling. So I hear this a lot. It's like, with friends, and they're like, God, I'll bring something up to my husband and I'm frustrated by it, and they'll just like stare, they'll just kind of blank, and they'll be like, it's fine. She's like, I have no idea what's going on inside their head. And it's like, I promise you there's stuff going on inside their head, because 2 hours later, I'm in the car with them side by, shoulder to shoulder, and they're telling me all the things that were in their head that they didn't say, while you were arguing. So there's that stereotype that men just aren't like thinking and aren't having these internal dialogues. So I think a really important part, from a clinical perspective, there's content and process, right? Content's what we say, but like process is what's happening. And so I really am trying to myself, but then also work with men in sharing process with people. So let's say I'll put it in the workplace. So say I'm, it's like, oh, Mark, you really, you let me down. Instead of saying that, I'll just be like, sorry, you're not getting promoted, or I'm not giving you this project, or there's just an outcome there. Instead of sitting down and being like, this is going to be a really hard conversation for me because you and I are friends. I really enjoy hanging out with you. You've been really inspired. You've been great here on the team. And these last couple of weeks, man, I don't know what's going on, but you've been really kind of checked out. And I've been afraid to share that with you because I'm not sure how you'll handle it. And I don't want to be like, that's process stuff. And I think if we could teach men to share their process a little bit more, things wouldn't be so surprising, to people in our lives. So I think that's, one. The other piece about kind of the internal is developing the skill of mindfulness. I've heard you talk about this on your show with guests. Like that is a foundational skill. Being able to experience physical sensations, thoughts, emotions, and then even our physical surroundings non-judgmentally and with curiosity. Because that, I think, is the foundation to avoid being reactive or avoid being regressive in a way, to say, whoa, say like my nose is tingling, I feel heat in my chest, like whatever, like getting in touch with those physical feelings, like, wow, I'm feeling some anger right now. And then pausing, being curious about it. I wasn't angry 5 minutes ago. I probably won't be angry later. What's different? What has happened? What did somebody say? And really starting to get a better understanding of the sequence of events that occur when you feel a certain way. So I think that's a real critical piece. And I've heard you talk about this, like when I work with emotions with men, I will often start physically, like just teach them to kind of break down what's happening in the body and then start to build these other pieces and build vocabulary on top of that. So that's what I mean about kind of that internal sense of masculinity.
Yeah, I like that you bring both those examples up, because what unites it to me is honesty. Like really committing to the truth, right? Like whether that be in what's processing between two people or mindfulness, like what's really happening for us. And I think when you talk to dudes, it's like, I think we can all get behind that the truth is better than lies. It seems to be like a universal thing of like, we want to be committed to the truth. It's what science is based off of, whatever, right? And I think it helps to frame it as like a courageous thing to be invested in the truth versus like being soft and sharing like every little time I get upset, Because I think that's what most guys hear is like, oh, I have to tell everyone every time I get upset, like I'm going to look like such a pussy, right? Like no one's going to want to hang out with me if I'm just complaining all the time. Versus like, no, we're going to actually get you to like really vocalize and be aware of like what's really happening, investing in truth.
Yep. Yeah. I like that frame. I hadn't thought about it in that, but that makes it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. So I'm curious, a little bit of a pivot, but it's kind of my pet thing. And if you've been listening to the show, I've brought this up a number of times, which is, when we talk about this masculinity thing of like the tough guy, the bully, right? The kind of like closed off dude, right? I see that so much as like Gen X and boomers, whereas I work with a lot of millennials and I feel like we're a different beast where we're that kind of like nice guy archetype, that kind of Robert Glover wrote about of, I think a lot of us are really accommodating and we're people pleasing and we say yes to everything. And underneath it, we're depressed. We probably are that kind of functional depression we were talking about earlier, but it's not that tough thing. And I think a lot of that was because we were raised by, feminist parents, and a lot of like equality was a big piece. And our messages were like, don't be an asshole like your dad, right? Or like, don't be like this other guy that hurt me in my life. So I think a lot of the contemporary stuff like doesn't fit with where men are now, because we're not bullies, but we are shut down. And I think we have a more like cold anger. Like I think it's more resentment versus explosion, you know? So I guess, yeah, question one, do you agree with that? If not, push back. And then question two, if you do, like, what do you do about that? Like where does this field go now that we're looking at like a different generation of masculinity?
I appreciate that. So I have tied this. So I'm almost 50, so I'm an angsty Gen Xer. So I like, I like actually how you describe that. I was the one like punching the roof of my car in high school, and you're like, I'm so glad you brought up that nice guy thing, because this has been like rolling around in my head probably for the last few years. Because I did some shadow work, I think during the beginning of part of the pandemic, when like I had some more time in my hands, when I wasn't, everything was shut down, and it was hard. Like, I did it for a couple of years. But here's one thing I discovered, and this is a phrase I use a lot, and I actually just shared it with some colleagues. The difference between being nice and kind. And I can't remember where I, had read this, but at some point I did. And for, I grew up mostly in the upper Midwest, moved around a lot, but, I'm in the land of Minnesota nice, where you're, smiling through gritted teeth.
Yeah.
And nice feels good because it pleases people. Right. And so it doesn't, it makes sense why people would adopt it and why men would adopt it. But it's also it's an observed thing. Like, people can see people being nice. And yet sometimes when we're nice, we are actually taking away people's agency. I'm going to give you some work examples in a second. So you can be nice, but not kind. And so years ago, I was a department chair for about 4 years. And looking back, I was really nice in the role. And so if somebody came to me with a problem, and I could solve it maybe in 30 seconds just because I knew what to do, and I would do that for them. But then they'd come back a week later asking for help for that same problem, and I'd help them. And then, eventually I built resentment. So what you had just said, like, if you're nice over and over again, and you're like, why can't you do this thing? My niceness actually got in the way of them, like developing a skill or an ability. So I have shifted instead, and it's a work in progress. So, let me be honest there. Kindness doesn't always feel nice in the moment, even though kindness over the long term actually is kind of a win-win. So back to that example, if somebody comes to me now and I can solve the problem really quickly, I might say, you know what, there's some resources out there. Like, you're talented, you're skilled. I know you can do it. So, I might point in that direction. But I said, why don't you struggle with it a little bit? I trust that you're going to be able to figure it out. Didn't maybe feel good. They maybe left being like, oh, I was hoping he would do that thing. But now they have agency. Now they learn it. And now they're not ever going to come back again because they've got that skill set. So I use that as an example in the workplace. But it shows up in personal relationships too. So that resentment piece, if I'm just being nice and letting my wife in this case, like, I don't want to hurt her feelings, or if I'm not expressing when I'm upset because I want to be nice, over time, it's going to lead to that silent resentment that then sometimes comes out in other ways. Versus, maybe the kind thing would be to say, you know what, I'm feeling ignored, or I feel like I'm working too much and I need you to pick up the slack. So that's kind of where I've kind of shifted. And I think with, and maybe that's a way to connect with millennial men, saying it's not that you have to give up being nice per se, but let's shift towards being kind. And what would that look like? Because it's still a nice word, and explain what the trade-offs are when we're nice, because we focus on the positive. And I think it's more important to focus, everything's a trade-off, right? And helping men understand what the trade-offs are when we behave, certain ways in interactions. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah. I mean, in Buddhism, the symbol of compassion is a sword, right? It's not like a, stuffed animal, right? Or a pillow, which is, I think, what men think compassion is. But it's this like sword that basically cuts through bullshit and gets to the real heart of the matter. And sometimes that means being aggressive or appearing aggressive or saying no to somebody, because that's actually what's needed in the moment to create that kindness and to move that person forward. I want to kind of zoom in on what you talked about with that resentment, because what I also see with a lot of guys, and my generations, I think especially, is grandiosity. Where it's like you said, that person's asking the same question over and over again. There's that resentment piece of like, why do you keep doing this? But then it builds up this idea of like, oh, I'm smarter than that person. I'm better than that person. And then it becomes no smarter than everyone in this goddamn place that I work. No one respects me. And it becomes this like kind of like brewing tornado. So I'm curious, yeah, if you see that and like what to do about that, because I think a lot of my generation is really lonely and grandiose at the same time. Like we think everyone's a sheep, right? Or like people are not as deep as us, or not as smart as us, or they don't get it. I think like a lot of millennials ended up that way, and we're really isolated because of it.
Well, and it's hard. It's funny because I don't want to get, oh, do I? So like, I don't want to get too like blamey on media and social media, but I mean, there's so much representation of excellence, and we're a hero worshiping culture. So I have had the benefit of teaching abroad and all over the place and travel a lot. And it's like, not every culture is like this, but we like worship heroes. We worship celebrity. And so I think in that aspirational sense, it's like, yeah, I want all the goodies that come with that. Meanwhile, the consequence of the trade-off to that is I will never be that good looking. I will never be that strong. I will never be that rich. I will never be any of these things. And so if men don't learn to sit with that and accept the gap and, learn to express gratitude in the sense of Buddhism, learn to experience suffering, without judgment. Then we're left with this. The only way to, get that is to act as if. And so then I do think you've got that kind of inflated sense of self, role playing, maybe hoping that nobody will see through, the veneer there. But that's incredibly vulnerable, right? Like to realize, I'm not. I may be talking a big game, but I certainly don't feel a big game. I'm struck by. I had a client in a men's therapy group years ago. I think it was a great story. He was, he grew up. He was biracial in a predominantly white community, so he suffered a lot of racism. He said he was pretty scrawny, and then like when he got older, he got into bodybuilding, and he went from being like this scrawny little guy to competing at about 350 pounds, and so he was a big dude. And he said the irony is, and here's what he described. He said, I watched the shell of my body grow to this giant size, and the little boy inside never changed. And so what happened was like there was this big gap between those two things. And he said the irony was people were now actually afraid of him, right? Like because he was physically. And so this thing that he had hoped would kind of gain him some kind of social capital now no longer like providing that to him. And that really struck with me. And I use that example sometimes with guys. So I share that as a way to go back to that idea of like, kind of fronting and, kind of building people up and being bombastic and yet having that big gap between what's being projected and what people are actually feeling on the inside.
Right. It's back to your point of like doing the inner work and really changing the inner mindset. Right. And I think our culture is being more curious about men. That's also what I'm hearing. Because there is a lot of that, like, if you're like jacked or like you are rich or whatever, right? Like no one asks you any questions. No one even thinks that you're suffering because you have those like very traditional masculine, prestige points, But if that guy's still that like little kid underneath, like that kid also needs to be seen. He also needs attention and figuring out like who he is and what he actually wants out of this world.
Yeah. I mean, we have so many projections about what that means for other men. Going back to like when I was in consulting, I do remember right before I started graduate school, I had read this article. It could have been Wall Street Journal. And the title was, It's Lonely at the Top. And it was this survey of like CEOs in the United States, and like these men just being like, no, I can't trust anybody. Everybody's a glad hander. Everybody's a yes man around me. Like there's nowhere to go. I'm like, I never really thought about that. Right. Cause I just think about, you're this rich, head of this giant corporation. Your life must be amazing. And I'm like, nope. But we have to like be curious. I'm glad that you said that. Like that curiosity piece is huge because we are judgy as hell, kind of culturally. And when I teach about self-compassion and mindfulness, it's like, you have to approach things with curiosity instead of judgment.
Yeah, I think it's so real. Like I work with a number of like quite wealthy clients, and they talk about that of like not trusting that people are not just their friends for their money, or that they're using them, or that they want something. And that often is the case. I mean, they're not like crazy, right? There are people that are trying to like infiltrate and like ingratiate and people please to move up their own ladder. And then you have this like weird sense of reality. It's the same as like a woman who's super attractive. I work with a number of them, and they also say like, I can't trust anybody because I don't think they want to just fuck me. Like I don't know what people's intentions are. I'm just trying to like go buy a coffee, and there's like all these dudes that are like being nice, but they all want something as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. I was thinking too, because we were talking about CEOs, but I know, beforehand, you and I were talking about, kind of working class guys, and then thinking about those men who, who society, or who they might perceive as society saying, I should be doing X, Y, or Z. I should be climbing ladders. And it's like, maybe that's not what we all actually isn't what we all want or need. Mm-hmm. And learning to be less judgmental about men's choices, about career and how they want to spend their time and mix things up. And I share this because it's a cultural pet peeve I have. My wife had this, somebody come, the speaker come in or do something for a school district. It was about social class. He kind of came in and he's like, so many of us will say, why wouldn't you want that high salary and blah, blah, blah. And he's like, okay, let me give you a day in the life of those individuals. Get up at 5 a.m. Maybe like a nanny comes, they don't get to see their kid. They're working in the evening. They've got no time to take vacation. Like, they're working 70 hours a week, blah, blah. Why is that the goal that we should get? Over here, you've got somebody maybe working 30 hours a week. Maybe, let's say they can pay their bills. They're not any like major, but they've got time to spend with their neighbors. They hang out with their family. They've got time with their kids. Like, why should we tell that person that they should be wanting something different? But I think, in the terms of kind of traditional cultural stereotype about men, it's like achievement, success, power. Like, if you're not like going for those things, then what's wrong with you? It's like, well, nothing. That's somebody else's path. But if we're all like colluding and like sharing that as the ideal, it makes it hard for the ones who don't want that.
Yeah. I mean, my mind goes right back to humility. And I think if men can be humble and be like, yeah, it's like cool to be a dad, it's cool to like master a hobby or to really focus on something that isn't just like income generation and wealth accrual, which is so much of what our culture is pushing on men. The only thing really men, that and like being ripped, right? Like that's basically all you got, right? I think in humility, we can actually get connection, because if we're all just fighting each other all the time for these like very limited spots, we're not on the same team. Right. I think men we can be very aware of hierarchies, and we're always like trying to place ourselves in those hierarchies. And, because of, I think you said, social media, we're often on the bottom because we're comparing ourselves to these experts where their whole life is about, whatever the thing is that we're trying to do. So I really do advocate like healthy humility for guys without being humiliated.
Yeah. Oh, I like that. Yeah. I like how you put it.
Actually connecting with other guys, being like, yeah, we're just like doing it. We're just living life.
Yeah.
How are you doing over there?
Yeah. But it's funny, that made me think about how like my own friendships have changed too, though. Like, and yeah, some of it's deliberate. Like, as I've gotten older, I have tried, like I've worked on my masculinity to try to be more, flexible and adaptive. And I look back, it's like you've got, maybe you have a high school group of guys who are friends who are like, comparing whose dick's bigger and who's had like all the fronting that happens in those. And now we're at the stage of life where we're on the opposite end, and we're just like trying to outdo each other with like how little sex we're having with our partners and how we're so, like, you're like
Pain Olympics, like just complaining as much as possible.
But more like if you, when you take that masculine pressure away, it's like you can even be like, you can joke about vulnerability, and you can just joke about humility, I guess is what I'm saying. Like we're not like story topping in those ways anymore. And like when there's a little bit of security in who you are, it actually frees you up to actually be vulnerable with each other. And I've seen that shift happen in our friendships. But it's like, I also had the benefit of time and like the will to do that. I wanted to share it because it's not mine. I know Sandra Bem initially had talked about, default gender being like, masculinity is like the default gender. My colleagues, Chris Kilmartin and Andrew Smiler kind of co-authored this Masculine Self as a textbook that I use. And they use this example of a smartphone. So I'm just going to share this because I think it's when I do workshops on it. So they'll say, and there's an image of it. So all of our phones have default options, like settings in them. And so masculinity is that way, where it takes 3 things to be able to change the default options. One is awareness. So you have to know that option even exists out there for you. And so like, if I don't know that do not disturb is an option on my phone, I'm not even going to press the buttons to use it. Number 2 is motivation. Like just because you know something exists doesn't mean you want to do anything differently. So then you have to, with gender and masculinity, you have to create that motivation to want to do something different. knowing those two things aren't going to get you anything. So you can tell me this exists and I want to make it happen, but until I learn the skill or have the ability to go in there and change the buttons, I'm still dead in the water. So same thing when I teach my gender course, like I introduce that model, and it's like, it's about moving from awareness to motivation to ability and skill. And once we get, men to that point, then they've got agency in saying, yeah, I want deeper friendships. And now I've maybe learned the skills on how to do that or practice them, or I want to, do better at work, whatever that looks like. I want to be more inclusive maybe in how I make decisions. Again, awareness, motivation, and skill. I like that model to kind of think about. You can change gender norms that way.
Yeah, I like that. I think it provides a pathway for dudes to follow and to be like, okay, this is where I'm at in the pathway, and here's the next step. And I think a lot of guys bounce off of therapy because it's just the first two, right? It's just like the insight part. It's just the mental part, but it doesn't have that challenge part. I think, to kind of get on a soapbox, I think where our field, in my view, needs to change is setting challenges for our clients, especially our male clients. Like once I do the trauma healing and the autobiography stuff with my guys, the sessions change. They become more about like briefing and debriefing, right? It's like, okay, this session, we're like going to do a briefing. You're going to go out, you're going to do your mission. And next session, we're going to talk about if you did it, if you didn't do it, how do you make it better? And back to a point you made earlier, the coaching model. I think that works really well for guys because it is kind of that. It's very action oriented. And it's like you get just enough insight to then be able to take the meaningful action. Because I think guys don't want to feel like we're just like spinning our tires. We want to feel like we're moving forward in our lives and growing and getting stronger and more skills.
Yeah. Yeah. That it's funny. I'd love to redo my dissertation because that was 25 years ago or something, or 20 years ago. It was on the difference of calling something coaching versus therapy. And it was like one of those analog studies where it was a couple situations where there was like an interview and you heard the guy talking and all they knew was it was one or the other. And actually, so coaching had less stigma. And this was with average age was 45, was a nationwide sample of men. Most were, working. But there was no difference in help seeking attitudes. So it's like, I'm fine. And I don't know how that would even play out now, but it's the getting over that seeking help piece that seems to be the biggest barrier. So yeah. I do like coaching as a model. I use it. And it's like, we got to get them to even that first coaching engagement. And I think that's where I see we fail as kind of traditional psychotherapy is if our expectation is like sitting, face to face in a room with a guy, that's pretty intimidating. They may not have the skill set. And I've been inspired by colleagues of mine who do therapy in all different ways. Like I have one who does walking therapy in Austin, Texas, because they can do, wilderness therapy. I think it's been a great avenue for a lot of people. Got friends in New York and New Jersey who, with their teens, they go out and play basketball. They go to the corner store and buy a candy bar. Like they're doing therapy everywhere except in an office.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think we also have to be more expansive in what we think about in those terms.
100%. I mean, I think you mentioned early in the episode, having the conversation like side by side, right in the car. I think it was Richard Reeves in the Boys and Men book where he talks about like, that is a validated way that men talk about their research, right? Like we don't look at each other, right? Like we are like often looking at, I guess, evolutionary, we're looking at like the elk or the deer or whatever, right? And talking side by side. But I think that's absolutely critical. It's like men need therapy in motion because I think we don't see the value in just talking. And I would go further and say like, I don't think there is as much value in just talking as there is for women. Something I say to my guys is like, men go through challenge and women go through relationships. So we have to like create challenge for our guys to like actually overcome them and again, coach them to do it, right? To actually do the thing.
Yeah. And talking is not going to work unless, or I should say until you develop that, a fuller emotional vocabulary and until you can get to a point where there's benefit to it. And so if we're just saying, well, men can't do therapy right, or we're saying you have to be able to do this out the gate, why are you dropping out or why aren't you coming? Then yeah, we're missing an opportunity to connect. Absolutely.
Right. Yeah. And if we're saying like men can't do therapy, it's probably like, no, therapy can't do men, right? Like I think as the provider, we have to adapt as an industry instead of just like gating, 50% of the population from engaging in this service. So as we're nearing the end, I have a question for you is, what do you think men need? Like, what do you think men need out there? What are we really lacking? And if you could do the magic wand question, right? Like, what would you change out there to help better support guys?
Well, we said the words, and these are the words that probably like are loaded and need to be like find ways to translate them. I think men need compassion and self-compassion. And I think people who have men in their lives need compassion for men. I think if we continue to see masculinity as inherently problematic, or as men as inherently broken, I don't see things changing in a positive way. So the most gratifying part about the course that I teach actually has been the students who come in really resistant. And I'm painting a broad picture here, but I'll have some majors in race, gender, sexuality, which we used to call women and gender. Sometimes they'll come in and say, "Hey, I've taken all these courses. I've taken courses on violence against women." And they're kind of like, "What are you going to teach me?" They end up leaving the class being like the biggest champions for gender change. And they're like, "I had no idea that men experience those types of pressures and restriction and that kind of stuff." And they say, "I am going to commit to changing the way I interact and think about men in my life and how I become a parent, how I parent." That is compassion and true empathy. And so I think we need to figure out ways to develop that broadly. And then the self-compassion, teaching men to take that same, self-kindness, common humanity, all the things that we see with self-compassion, and be able to apply it to themselves. Instead of defaulting, which, I think many of us were raised with self-criticism, and learning that's not the powerful motivator that we probably once thought it was.
Right. Exactly. I think that's like really well said. It's like improving out of love. When you think about having a child, like you're going to push your kid because you love them, versus you're not just going to like beat the shit out of them and tell them they need to do better. Right. And I think it's men, we need to hear that. It's like you still do stuff, right? Compassion doesn't mean that you're just like given a pass on everything, or that it's really, passive and soft and, all pour their little thing, right? Like, I think that doesn't work for us at all, and a lot of like what I call validation therapy, like doesn't work for men. Of just like agreeing with our pain doesn't work with it. I think it needs to be seen, but then also, okay, what are you going to do about it? That extra like action or skills piece that you talked about too.
Well, and you mentioned Buddhist psychology before, and I know I think there's more being written about it, but like typically when we think about compassion, we think about the yin energy of it, right? It is that kind of like soft kind of, and it's like, I think when I introduce the concept of kind of yang energy and compassion, like you can have fierce compassion by setting boundaries and saying no and taking breaks and like doing these things. I think we also kind of have to expand, like when we talk about compassion, what that can look like. So it's not like somebody has to sit in a lotus position on a mat, like, doing loving kindness meditation, which is wonderful. There are many ways, other ways to be able to experience and give compassion. And I think we have to expand what that means. I think we have a better chance of connecting with a broader range of men that way too.
I agree. Yeah. I think framing it as like a heroic and courageous act instead of an act of like weakness and enabling, I think it's really critical. Well, Ryan, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a fantastic episode. Where can people learn more about you and the work that you've done?
Yeah, I mean, I've got a website, drmckelley.com, and I've got a LinkedIn profile. But I mentioned before, I've kind of backed away from some of the social media stuff. I'd say it's not my skill set. I have an opportunity here in higher ed to do my work and do my workshops. But yeah, certainly if people want to reach out, you can find me at those locations. I just want to say I appreciate the work that you're doing, and you clearly have talent and skill in this area, through podcasting and reaching men. And so I'm grateful that there's folks like you, Marc, who are doing this work, because please keep doing it and getting the word out.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think like both of us are part of this bigger wave that's happening. I think there was the men's movement in the 90s, and I think it went underground, and I think now it's starting to come back again as having more conversations and modeling conversations that have emotional depth and emotional intimacy for guys. So yeah, if you're listening out there and you're inspired, certainly reach out to Ryan, reach out to me. All that info will be in the show notes. If there's a guy that needs to hear this, or a parent, someone who's raising a boy, I think this conversation would be really good for a parent that wants to learn about what masculinity is and how it can be evolved into a more malleable form. So Ryan, thank you again. And listeners, thank you for tuning in. We'll see you next week, another episode of the Men's Therapy Podcast.
Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe and leave a review. And don't forget to visit menstherapy.online to learn more about the work that we are doing to support and inspire men. Until next time, keep moving forward.